Hello, and welcome to the third podcast in our series for the New York Psychiatric Rehabilitation Training Academy. My name is Danielle Labate Cavelli, and I'm joined today by Rita Cronice and Martha Barbone. Today's topic is sharing power, developing a non-hierarchical working relationship. There's been a common theme or thread throughout all of our podcasts so far, and that's about how we can help foster hope and build relationships with people who participate in services. In our first podcast, we heard stories of how providers worked with people who were either unsure of what they wanted out of life or were actively working towards a valued life role. Last month, we heard from a chief operating officer about how she and the staff at the agency she works at work together to see someone as an individual and become more aware of who people are, their preferences, the environments in which they live, work, learn, or socialize in, and how they identify. Today, we're continuing the conversation and exploring relationship building through the idea of shared power. To start the conversation, I'm going to turn it over to Rita Cronice. Rita, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and then introduce Martha, who'll do the same?
Well, thank you, Daniela. My name is Rita Cronice, and I'm a person who has lived with mental health challenges for all of my life, I think. I wanted to just share one brief example of when I had an experience of unequal power. And that was after a hospitalization where I had stopped eating for about a month, and I had an altered state of consciousness, if you will. And the doctors were telling me that I needed to have ECT. And in fact, it was my 21st birthday. And I remember this because my birthday was yesterday. So 43 years ago to the day yesterday, I was signing a consent form on my 21st birthday for electroconvulsive therapy. The doctors had been telling my parents that I needed this, that I was not ever going to leave the hospital if I didn't have it. And they were telling me that I wasn't going to leave the hospital if I didn't have it. And I wasn't really given any other choices. And there wasn't really, to my recall, any conversation about what was going to happen as a result of having this treatment, what the side effects of the treatment were going to be, what my parents were going to have to face once I had the treatment. It was just a matter of having to sign the consent form. Boom, that's it. So that's just a quick example of many of the stories I could tell of having lived through the mental health system as a person receiving services, and of really not having an experience of having any kind of shared power at all. But that's a little bit about me, and I'm a little more about me is they told me I wasn't ever going to be able to go back to school, to be able to have a relationship, to ever be able to hold down a job. I have a very wonderful relationship with my husband. I have a 30-year-old son now who's terrific, and I have a job where for 10 years, I've been developing training programs for the Academy of Peer Services for the New York State certification program for peer specialists. And I now have taken a new job as co-director of a peer support technical assistance center. So I've actually done quite well in spite of the predictions that were not so good for me back when I was 21. That's just a quick example. And I think the one thing I would say that I wish had been different back in those days, and maybe could still be different now, is for the doctors, instead of knowing so well that what they thought was good for me and what was going to happen to me, if we'd had more conversations about what was happening, what was going on at that time, what the options were, what my choices were, what else could have happened. Because I later found out that many times when I was experiencing those altered states of consciousness, it was because I had a urinary tract infection. I was very susceptible to that. So it wasn't necessarily even a mental health issue. It was probably a physical health issue that put me there. And had we had any conversation about that at the time, I might not have had to have endured the treatment that I did. With that, I'd like to introduce our guest for today, because I'm actually interviewing a very dear friend of mine, Martha Barbone. Martha, how would you like to be referred to?
Martha is fine.
Okay, Martha, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, Rita. And I spent over 20 years, in mental health treatment. I too was told very early on that it was unlikely I would ever live on my own, raise my children, or work again. And, at that time, that I was feeling pretty hopeless, and that just confirmed how hopeless it was. And I think that colored my future care, because not only did I believe that I would have a full life, but I don't think most of the people who worked with me on my treatment team believed that either. But since then, and why I'm here today, I was the director of the Certified Peer Specialist Program in Massachusetts for several years and on the board of the National Association of Peer Supporters and worked as their director of operations for a time. I've also worked as an advisor a lot with the Veterans Administration and also with the National Center on Advancing Peer-Centered Practices and Systems. Just a little to show that I did go on to work. I'm now back in what I originally did. I'm a veterinarian, and now I work again with animals doing veterinary imaging, doing very well. I did raise my 3 children, and I do live on my own.
Wonderful. So we've both proven the system, at least the doctors that didn't think we could make it, that we could. Sometimes think about the idea that, at least you and I think, had something in our spirit, this determination to say, oh yeah, well, we'll show you that led us to go on and do things in spite of what we were told. But I wonder about people that, don't have that spirit and don't have the ability to have that determination, and how it is that providers today can change that dynamic and make it easier for people to be able to find their way without having to fight their way to success.
That's interesting because I don't think I had that spirit initially. Initially, I believed everything as it was told to me, and I thought I was right where I needed to be, that I was this broken person, and whatever happened to me is not only what I needed, but what I deserved. And I kind of developed in me this idea that really I was a bad person, even though I might sometimes do good things. I was this bad person that needed to be fixed, needed to be changed. It was like that for several years. Really, the turning point for me was finding peer support. The very first time, it was probably about 14 years into treatment when I first met a peer specialist. And it was kind of like, wait a minute, you've been in some of the same positions I've been in and you have a job? Because I thought I was going to be a permanent patient. That was my life. So that started at least getting me thinking, well, could things be different? And what would that look like? Because I'd never had that discussion. The discussions were always about, how can you stay safe till I see you next? It wasn't ever about, what do you want out of your life and how can we get there?
Yeah, those life affirming conversations are so important. And I had a mentor who once told me, at least in the context of peer support, but I think it's really in the context of any kind of human support, if we can stop for a moment and think about the interaction we're about to have with somebody and say, is what I'm about to say going to give somebody hope, or is it going to take hope away? That can really change the whole dynamic of working with a person. And when we talk about shared power, when we're helping people to find hope for themselves, we're giving them power back. So I think that's really important. So I'm wondering about, if we think about the term empowering, because I often hear, and it makes me a little bit crazy when people say, well, I'm going to empower you. What do you think about that, Martha?
It's interesting. Like when we think about empowerment, if I kind of think of it as the opposite, how am I not going to take power away from you? So many of my experiences were about really people on my treatment team letting me know I wasn't in power and didn't have power, not only about what was going on in that treatment setting, but in my life, and that I needed someone to take power, because I wasn't capable. And so if I think of empowerment, when did I realize, I have some control, I have some ideas about what would help? When did that come about that I could, actually speak up? And for me, a big thing that comes up is being talked with instead of at or about. Even when I was in like team meetings, I remember sitting in the team meeting I was on one side of a table with several of my treatment team on the other side, and they would talk about me, even though I was sitting right there and there was a picture over their head. And I remember very clearly, I would just go into that picture and walk down that path, and they're talking all about me, and I'm in the picture up over their head. I probably would agree to anything they told me. And I don't remember, being asked what I thought other than, is that okay? Oh, yes. Okay. So that invitation that this is a partnership, this is a collaboration. You are part of this discussion and we want to hear from you. I think that's the big first step.
Yeah. And you're reminding me in the webinar we talk about being trauma informed and being trauma responsive, because there's 6 stages of trauma responsiveness, and understanding that people are have been traumatized in the past. And sometimes, like you said, you went away into the picture. That's one of the classics of, you're being talked about, so you just go away and you don't even pay attention to what's going on anymore. Realizing that people may be experiencing, a trauma response based on being in a traumatic situation, which often happens in these healthcare situations. It's just so important for us to stop and help people to come back to present. Some of the mindfulness techniques of, taking deep breaths and kind of picking out things around the room that you're paying attention to and coming back into your body and being present again, and helping people in a gentle way to do that, I think, is one of the most important ways that we can, again, it's about sharing power, but it's also recognizing when people feel totally powerless, where do they go? And how do we bring them back so that we can engage them again and help them to start to feel a sense of their own agency and their own power again? I'm sort of thinking about, there's another thing that we talk about in the webinar, which is this triad of the persecutor, the rescuer, and the victim. We talk a little bit about that and how these power dynamics can happen, especially in healthcare situations. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, Martha, or not, or do you want me to say more?
Definitely, I can see where I've experienced all of that, and definitely initially on, I was in the role of victim where I honestly didn't believe I could care for myself. And I don't think I entered into the system that way. When I sought help, I was still taking care of my family and still working. And then I ended up hospitalized. And by the way that I was treated, I began to believe I couldn't take care of myself. And at that point, even if someone asked me to be involved, what do you want? What do you need? I'm not sure I could have told them, because I had lost touch with the idea that I might even know what I wanted or needed. Mm-hmm. But then, as things progressed and actually getting more involved in peer support, I found, my human nature to be the rescuer. If someone's in distress, I want to make it better. And sometimes we jump in and rescue in that role where I'm assuming they can't help themselves. I'm going to go in and make it better. And how that's sort of the natural inclination, and then having to take a step back and notice that, I'm not in the driver's seat here. I'm going to walk this journey with you. What would you like? What can I do to support you to get where you want? And not doing for you, but supporting you to do it either with me or on your own.
Right. Yeah. And the other angle off of that triad is the persecutor. And so often when we encounter people, we don't realize when they have taken on the persecutor role, when they've done something that's been abusive or harmful, that they themselves are often the victims of that kind of dynamic, and I think also I agree with the rescuer piece. I think many people who go into gravitate towards peer support as well as the larger, the other professions, there's a natural tendency to want to help people. That's a really human response. And where it goes a little bit awry is when we start taking power away from people to do things for themselves and be able to learn how to fish as opposed to fishing for them, to use that metaphor. So I'm going to read just a little bit. There's one of our practice guidelines in peer support is, by definition, peers are equal. Shared power in a peer support relationship means equal opportunity for each person to express ideas and opinions and offer choices and to contribute. And so there's that whole idea of equal power and mutual reciprocal kinds of have, which are not as easy to do, I think, in the healthcare professions. But I'm wondering what elements of that might be brought more fully, into especially psych rehab practice.
I think a lot of what we do in peer support, other providers in the mental health system can also do. The one thing that kind of sets us apart is this idea of sharing my story. We use that as a way of hope, and that's not typically what other people do. But the first thing that comes to my mind is about language, that we use language in general in a way that we both understand what words mean to each of us. And the biggest thing that comes to mind for me is like using the word safety. We hear the word safety all the time in the mental health system. And for me, I often heard, I'm going to keep you safe. And that didn't feel safe at all to me. An inpatient locked unit did not feel safe to me. But we never had that discussion of, what would be safe to you. Or, when you talked about, this idea, like when I was in the picture, well, if we could talk to someone about what's going on and how do we get back and be present instead of just saying, come back, you're not here again, get back here, this kind of, the language we use, and even, the medical language, making sure if you use medical terms that you take the time to explain them and fully understand. And even with a diagnosis, does the diagnosis, what does it mean to me? Does it empower me in some way that it helps me make sense of what's going on for me? Or does it make me hopeless? When I look at diagnoses, I think, one, it should help me and my treatment team understand what's going on for me better. It should help tailor my treatment into what's better, and for an outcome. And it's only a little part of me. It's not all of me. But so often what I'd see is, everything I said or did being looked at through the lens of that diagnosis, when some of what was going on for me was just normal, everyday being a human. Most of what was going on. And the idea, there's a lot of different diagnoses, and sometimes I'll talk to people, and I'm not going to say this generally applies to everyone, but we hear depression a lot, if we believe the statistics, I think everybody's experienced it at some point, and that's not too big. But, I'll talk to young providers. I said, okay, your next appointment, they have this diagnosis, depression, or maybe they have bipolar, and you start thinking before you meet this person already how you're going to deal with that. And then you hear the person has schizophrenia, and some people, oh, well, I got to be prepared for this. And then you hear, oh, your next patient has borderline personality disorder. And most people go, oh, no, what am I going to do now? These people we can't deal with. And so how can we move away from that, making assumptions about someone before we've even learned about them and gotten to know them? Can we just go in and meet, face to face as if you were meeting someone over coffee and find out what's going on and get away from that lens, very small lens of maybe what brought them to see you.
Right. And that even translates to behavior, as far as, I love the story you were telling earlier about Steve with the guy that was not employed, but he was, that was the goal, was to get him employed.
Yeah. Steve had that great story. And where supporting someone, and his job was to was to talk to this person about getting employed, and asked him, what would you like to do? And he goes, well, really, my goal is to be able to afford to buy my fifth and sit on my porch and drink it and watch the world go by. The reaction in the system usually is, well, that's not an appropriate goal. Let's not talk about that. Let's talk about, what you want to do for work. But instead, what Steve did, okay, well, what would you need to be able to do that, to be able to get to that goal? Well, you'd have to have money to be able to afford that, even to be able to afford to have a porch and to buy the fifth so you could sit and drink it. And so they approached it from that way, and the person got a part-time job. And I'll shorten the story, but, ended up liking what they were doing, ended up getting offered a full-time position. And that person totally changed what he thought he wanted out of life. It was never the discussion about your goal, was not good for you. It wasn't important. We have to change your goals. It started with, okay, if that's your goal, how do we move forward from there? And this person did go on to work and have a full life. So that's an example, but it doesn't happen very quickly. I wouldn't say, immediately, that didn't happen in a week. That probably happened over many months or even longer. and being able to be patient with that.
Yeah, and so that's a great example of really what shared power is all about. It's not making an assumption that I know what's better for you. What's important to you isn't as important as what I know is important for you. It's about what can we talk about together to help you to understand, to get to your goal. And I think that's a really great story. I'm wondering, as far as shared power goes, coming back to our prime topic here, what kinds of words of wisdom might we offer to psych rehab practitioners who really are maybe seeing for the first time that there is a power imbalance? It's something that becomes so invisible when you're in the middle of the system and you think that what you're doing is exactly what the person needs. But how would you talk to practitioners for today?
I think one thing is looking at your role, what's required of you in that role, and actually approaching it from that way. Do you have power in your role in that system you work in? You have power to be flexible about how you carry about your duties every day, and just notice yourself. Do you have that, and how does that feel? And then also recognizing when there's duties or required by the system maybe aren't how you would go about best supporting that person to move forward, but that's required of the system. We often talk, I'll refer it back to peer support, but I think it applies to everyone. How can I do what's required of me while I'm trying to make change? If there's something I'm required to do that really doesn't seem to be helpful to the people I'm supporting, are there ways that I can work with those that are in power to make change, to change those while I'm still working with this person and keeping my job? So some of the ways are instead of jumping right to a checklist, we have to go over this today. We have to do this today, starting every day by, what's going on? What's going on since we talked last? What's important for you today that we talk about or accomplish? Instead of going into every meeting with your own agenda. Other ways are, do you talk about the person when they're not present? Do you have meetings about the people you support that they're not allowed to be part of? And kind of examine, why do we do that? And I've asked other providers this before, and it's like, well, I can say things that I would never say to your face. I said, do you like that people say things behind your back that they couldn't say to your face? And I think we get into this assumption that it has to be this way, but if we step back and look at it, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. I think a really important thing is helping people find their own words and prepare for conversations. Like I mentioned earlier, there was a time I said, if you'd asked me, what do you want or what do you need? How can I help you? I would have said, I don't have any idea. You're the professional. You're the expert here. You tell me what to do. How do we support someone to move beyond that? And for me, a big question is, if there's nothing today that you can think of you want to do, what were things that made you happy, gave you joy, gave you purpose in the past? And we talked about that. And then it moved to, do you do any of that now? Would you like to do any of that? Why or why not? Is there something, from my past that I can bring out that reminds me, yeah, I do have some control. I do have some knowledge of how I work and what makes me feel better.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Martha. I think I'm going to go ahead and read this poem not really a poem. It's a description of power that I shared during the webinar, but I think it may be important to share here as well, just as a reminder that power by itself is a positive thing. It's a source of energy or strength or authority, as in the power vested in me. But the misuse of authority has turned power into something negative, sometimes sinister. Power over implies an imbalance of power, with the one on top being more, the one on the bottom being less powerful. Being on the bottom of the situation, we may call up power against some foe. Hence, power becomes an opposing force, or opposing forces in tension with each other. It may also be a liberating force when power becomes the strength to overcome. If we join forces with others, we combine our own power with others, and we use it for something good. It's a quote from the Transformer with AVP. So I think that's a great way to sort of sum up the idea that when we share power together, when we join forces with others, when we combine our own strengths and our own power with the power that other people have within themselves, we can move so much further than we can when we try to be in opposition with each other or try to have power over each other. So I think I'll end it with that. I'm Rita Cronice. I'm with the Academy of Peer Services and Peer Tech. And Martha, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Rita.
Thank you both for a wonderful conversation about power. I hope you, our listeners, have found today's conversation helpful as you work towards a more shared power dynamic, which is critical in supporting someone on their personal recovery journey. Thank you for listening. We hope that you'll tune in again next month when we speak on the topic of culture change.